circulating.com. Welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined by Ted Baker of Finger Lakes Morning News. I'm sure you have heard him over on WGVA and WAUB. You guys have had some challenges in the last few days. If you want to just give our listeners a quick update when it's coming back or when 1240 is hoped to be coming back and what that issue has been.
Knock on wood, I think it might be today. The power supply for the AM 1240 transmitter failed last week. We have a contract engineer who was set to put in the new part. He came down with a flu. It's not a simple thing that just anybody can do because a lot of voltage flows through these transmitters, and if you do it wrong, you could zap yourself to death. So it's not something that you can just plug in and turn it back on and you're good to go. So we're on 95.9 FM in Geneva, hopefully 1240 AM, maybe today. If all works out, it'll be back.
And moral of that story is?
Well, we've learned a lot over the last few days that there is still a significant amount of listening on AM, and also that no matter how many times you tell people you're on FM, they don't necessarily get it because it fades into the background. It's like when somebody posts a note above the microwave at work and says, wash your own dishes or something. It fades into the background after a while. Nobody notices it anymore, and they just don't pay attention. So
yeah, and the other moral is get your flu shot.
Yeah.
So there are a ton of stories we're going to be talking about and cutting through today. One that actually just came into us this morning. A lot of folks are up in arms over the sentencing of a sex offender in Schuyler County Court this week. 33-year-old Sean Wheeler of Tyrone in Schuyler County was found guilty in November on several charges after a sex abuse case was tried. He was found guilty on 3 separate counts of third-degree sex abuse, 1 count of second-degree criminal sex act, which is a Class D violent felony. He was accused of sexually abusing his 13-year-old stepdaughter family member who is mentally disabled. So prosecutors wanted to see, they had requested 7 years sentence in state prison, along with 10 years post-release supervision, and of course registering as a sex offender. However, the judge who was overseeing that case, Dennis Morris, was only sentenced to weekends in jail, and he will also have to register as a sex offender. Think about that, folks.
Yeah. Right off the bat, you say that case seems to touch every level of egregiousness that you could have, young, family member, mentally disabled. So has any explanation been given by the judge, or was this just a straight judge trial or jury trial, or do you know?
So I can't speak to what the case, how it was tried. I'm assuming it was a jury trial. It seemed to have gone through the typical process. As for reaction to it, there pretty much has been none, other than a lot of outraged folks down there.
Yeah.
Emailing us. There has been pretty stable. We were actually a little bit late to the gun on this one. We didn't get word about this until this morning. Obviously, we've put the story up on fingerlakes1.com, but this is just, it's when people talk about all the different reforms that are necessary in our criminal justice system, this has to be atop the list. If we're going to talk about fixing the criminal justice system, let's fix sentencing first. The fact that this is even possible is, I think, insane. It doesn't even, you can understand that in certain circumstances there are going to be exceptions made, or there are going to be, but when that happens, there needs to be a really lengthy explanation as to why it happened.
Right. Well, and I like the fact, I'm not a proponent of minimum sentences and tying judges' hands, because there are extenuating circumstances. No two cases are alike, but I don't see any here. I can't imagine what defense you would make of that lenient a sentence in a case like that.
And we're talking, I just want to say these words again, Class D violent felony. We're not talking about misdemeanor. We're not talking... Right. We're talking about a serious crime that was effectively just overlooked, I guess. Or, the thing is I could understand, and you see the same type of outrage, I guess, when someone is sentenced to 2 or 3 or 4 years, when prosecutors are asking for a decade or 7 years or maybe 2 decades, something like that. But we're talking about, this is almost like the 0 to 100 thing. Like,
it just
they're not
doesn't
even in the same ballpark of one another.
I'd be curious as if more details come out, because it just doesn't pass the smell test at all.
Yeah, it's just, and we have also heard that the additional stress and burden this had put on this particular family, the victim in the case was taken away from her mother as a result and separated from her mother and siblings, and it's just on top of everything else. It is just this really bizarre, awful, sad situation that just seems inexcusable. It doesn't seem like how it can even happen.
Well, and the name of the offender doesn't ring any bell to me, whether it might be some prominent person in the community or something. I mean, not that excuses it by any means, but I know sometimes a person's reputation and or position are taken into account. But especially the discrepancy between the final sentence and the prosecutor's recommendation. I mean, it's just not even close.
Right? They're not even in the ballpark of one another.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we do see, and I guess that's where I'm kind of curious. Does this surprise you at all that we haven't seen more effort out of state lawmakers to correct what is clearly a broken sentencing system or sentencing guidelines, if that's the core of the issue?
Well, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of agreement. Typically, Republicans are hard on crime. Democrats are portrayed by Republicans as soft on crime. Democrats have concerns that sentences are handed out disproportionately by race, that black offenders face harsher sentences. So I just don't think that there's any, like so many things we talk about, there doesn't seem to be a real good starting ground or any sort of core agreement that we can work from.
It's funny to me, and I agree, I get it completely. That part of it makes it very hard to start the conversation or to have that conversation begin in Albany. But the flip side of it is like, hello, this is a fundamental issue. Like, this is sentencing guidelines are the building blocks. If you want to address all the other things, you're going to have to address sentencing guidelines first, because if they are impacting a disproportionately large African-American community or black community or whatever the minority community is that you feel is disproportionately affected by it, you have to change it if you want to stop the over-sentencing of minorities, I guess. It just doesn't, to me, it doesn't make logical sense to approach it the opposite way, or to think that any real change is going to come from starting at the other end of the spectrum, working your way backwards.
And the other question we have to answer is, are we willing to pay the increased costs of housing more people longer if we make harsher sentences? I mean, that's one of the arguments that people make against the sentences given to nonviolent drug offenders, is that we're using all these prison resources and taxpayer resources to put people in jail who really didn't do any harm to anyone else other than themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. So another one of the criminal justice items that we have been talking about over the last several weeks, the mugshot proposal that Governor Cuomo had thrown out there a few weeks ago. We got a little bit of an update on that. So it'll only apply to state agencies, so like state police. It won't impact county, local type agencies, which is the first part of what I want to discuss. And then the second part of it is on the heels of the court decision that body cam footage is subject to public disclosure, do these two things not like these two things seem to be going in opposite directions? And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, with that court ruling now being in the books, unless it's going to be pushed back against somehow, does it even make sense to try to move forward with this mugshot proposal? Because literally, if we're talking about body cam footage being part of public disclosure, then certainly mugshots and police reports are public disclosure required, right? Like, come on.
Well, I think that the more transparency in government, generally, the better government we get. There are always going to be reasons why certain information needs to be withheld, but I think we always need to err heavily on the side of openness in any kinds of these discussions, because that's when you start having abuse in government, is when its workings, as in another story we're going to discuss, are kept hidden from the public. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why they call them representatives. They are there to do our bidding and our work for us. And so, and of course, as a person who's been in the media my whole life, I think that we're better served as a society the more we know about the inner workings of our criminal justice system and our government.
Yeah, and you know, kind of the flip side of that is, or the flip component to that is, I think it would be more, and I've said this numerous times now, it feels like an echo chamber, require law enforcement agencies that publish this information to also publish follow-up reports. If they're going to report on it, force them to also publish the follow-up reports, or require the DA's office or the county court's office, or whatever the case, or the town courts, require them to publish results, if you will.
Right.
So that, and you know, this is one of those things where I've listened to some debates on this topic, and you know, a lot of folks are saying, well, it's time for the news media to look at these cases differently, or to not cover them if you can't get access to all of the information. Well, that's just not how it works. I'm sorry, but it's one thing to say that all of this information is going to be openly provided, and then everyone has a clear avenue to either do something with that information or not do something with that information. Then you can make the argument, well, they're not painting the complete picture. They're in the wrong as a news organization. To say that in the current state of the news business, that every agency or every news agency has to go out and basically track down every case in every policing agency and every court system is just, it is so unrealistic. And it's almost surprising, because I feel like some of the news agencies that are kind of taking this stand, or some of the folks in the media who are taking this stand, are also the people who frequently talk about the necessity of transparency in government. And you cannot have transparency in government, especially when it comes to policing, which is about as scrutinized as anything right now. You cannot have that and this new proposal without creating a hole on the other side, or a deficit on the other side.
Well, what you're talking about, this causes us difficulties all the time. We have a police beat section, and you have a police blotter section in Finger Lakes 1, and so we get calls from people that generally it's a young person. They've maybe gone to apply for a job, and the employer Googles their name, and the very first thing that comes up is some accusation, usually of some petty offense, shoplifting or something, and they'll call us up and say, well, that case was dropped. And as you say, we have no way of knowing whether that was true or not. I think it would be a good idea. I'm always loath to force agencies or force people to do things, because I just think we force too much already. But it would be a good idea if, at the very least, if the person goes to court and is found not guilty, that we get that release as well, so we can add that information. It isn't the perception sometimes of the media is that we intentionally report some things and withhold others. For the most part, that's not the case. Generally, we report what we get. But as I've said, the police department has a public relations department. Some kid that got arrested for shoplifting doesn't, and so that information doesn't come out. So, and the way generally when I handle those, if somebody requests nicely, we will remove that article, and then I explain to them, here's what's going to happen. When they Google your name, you're still going to see that link for a few days. It's going to be a dead link because we've taken the story down. Then eventually Google's algorithm will catch up to it and it'll disappear completely. Most people are nice about it. They say, hey, look, this happened. I was young. We pleaded it out. It was dismissed, whatever. I get the occasional ones who call up and scream and yell and threaten with a lawyer, and for them, I leave it up.
It's interesting because, like, we've actually, our approach is similar, but maybe a tiny bit different, just because at that point, you know, and I almost look at it as they're looking through a very narrow lens. So they think by taking this particular story down that's on Finger Lakes Daily News or fingerlakes1.com that it's apparently just going to be wiped from everything.
Right, and that's probably not going to happen. That's a good point, because sometimes people will call us up and they'll say, well, okay, you realize Finger Lakes 1 has this, the Finger Lakes Times has it, maybe the DNC has it, and it's pretty hard to just scrub something from the internet.
And to that end, I mean, I would say the biggest offenders now of publishing, while a lot of people, I would say, lean towards either Finger Lakes 1 or Finger Lakes Daily News being police blotter heavy, it's actually the TV stations in Rochester and Syracuse that are far more heavy and prevalent with the police beat items than any of the rest of us are. And that's usually what I try to tell people when they call. You know, most of them, 99% of them are nice, and even the ones who are initially a little combative, because I think they frankly have the right to be a little bit combative right off, coming out of the gate.
And I think sometimes
don't understand.
Right. Sometimes they're combative because they expect us to be.
Right.
And when you just say, okay, I don't want to ruin some kid's life who's going out over a shoplifting. So if somebody says, gee, it would be really helpful if you took this off, it's like, okay, sure, we can do that.
And it sort of goes back to this entire idea that's like, you said it. Nobody in the media is out to ruin anybody's life. No one is like out here trying to crush some 17-year-old's dreams of being able to work wherever he wants to work or do whatever he wants to do in college and beyond because of some minor incident. But this is an issue that isn't going to go away. And if passed at the state level for state level agencies, probably only a matter of time before it passes on the local level or the local side. I think some different things are going to have to be worked out along the way to make sure that information is still free flowing and being passed between does this just, because it kind of goes back to the idea of some agency is still going to want to claim credit for doing the thing that they are supposed to do. Police agencies send out press releases because they want credit for doing their job. Their job is to arrest people and to uphold the law. And when they see people breaking the law, or what is their perception of breaking the law, because even that's debated now, they do their job and then they shoot out a press release about it. And, that is the process.
And you make a good point, because law enforcement can make the case that it's not up to us to deal with the finding in court. Our job is to make arrests and to deter crime and to prevent crime, but it's our job to turn people over to the criminal justice system. It's not our job to monitor what happens to them once they're in it. And that's a decent point.
Yeah. And so let's transition a little bit here. Wayne Central Board of Education. Parents heard from them this week after official misconduct allegations had surfaced last month about two first-year board members. The duo, identified as Steve Gallagher and Dennis Landry, were elected in 2018 and defeated a pair of incumbent board members. Residents hope to learn more about the allegations lodged against them this week, but surprise, that didn't happen. The allegations include the two entering a closed school within the district, which was shut down with a little bit of controversy attached to it as well, an elementary school. But that's pretty much as we know. And the Board of Education actually passed a resolution at that meeting earlier this week allowing the information about the charges to only be released at the misconduct hearing, which is scheduled to take place in March. Parents and faculty are unhappy with the situation, and one parent told News 10 NBC this week that they were, quote, very disturbed by what had happened. This is just government transparency, municipal clarity, whatever you want to call it. 101 stuff right here. We talked about it this morning on your show. If you're going to go down this road and you're the school board, you want to not only, I would say, the same day as you go public with the official misconduct charges, you go public with an information statement, making it very clear how you got there, why you're there, and what's next. Not this 30-day sort of period for things just to stir up, because that is literally all that's happened over the last 20 or 30 days since this information became public knowledge.
Well, and I think when people run for elected office, they should understand that they are under greater scrutiny, that they're, again, like I said earlier, they're representing us. And so if you're a parent in the district and you hear official misconduct, you want to know. If it's some minor thing, you want to know to ease your mind. If it's some major thing, you want to know what they're doing about it. And over my years of experience, I'm not sure why, but it strikes me that school boards tend to often have the biggest problems with being transparent. And part of it is, we talked about this once before, the responsibilities placed on these people is awesome. And without training, you don't go to school board school. If you're a town supervisor or something, the Association of Counties might have a little bit of training or something, but it's a big responsibility. But it just, the problem with keeping these things hidden is it just creates a bigger cloud of speculation, and questions and rumors and misinformation get started. It would seem to be in everyone's best interest to say, this is why we're taking this action, this is what's been alleged to have happened, and we will get to the bottom of it and find out the truth.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because now you also have the portion of this debate, this argument that's sort of squaring around the idea that maybe these two individuals were frequent dissenters on a variety of issues that the board mainly wanted to see get passed. They may have been against closing that school to begin with. Some questions I had heard yesterday raised were maybe that the district was not properly caring for that school that they went and looked at and went into after they discovered an open door, allegedly, or an unlocked door. All of these things are at play, but no matter what, everyone in this situation benefits from transparency. Everyone. Period.
Well,
from day one.
Again, if all they did was to go check on a school to see for themselves and said, hey, look, a door's open, let's go in, with innocent intent, and I don't know if that's the case, but if that's all it is, then say so and problem over. If it's more than that, again, say so. It's just, it's very easy to hide behind that veil, and we've all seen governmental bodies that abuse executive sessions. The law specifically limits what can be discussed in those sessions, and then we've all covered meetings where there's a 2-hour executive session followed by an announcement in open meeting that we've taken no action, see you later.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where people now, they're going to look forward and they're going to go to that meeting, and because of how it's been handled thus far, no matter what they say, no matter what information they provide, they could provide all of the information they have. It still will probably not be enough to satisfy what people believe is happening behind the scenes.
Because now it's suspect. By
exactly
going behind the curtain, you've made what you say going forward suspect.
Yeah. And you're right, like maybe the core issue. And here's the thing that doesn't, if we're talking about just my opinion, as I understand, I believe it's a 9-person board or something to that effect. Even with 2 constant dissenting votes, if that's what these 2 individuals are doing, they're just constant dissenters and they just vote against everything. After they unseat 2 incumbents, it is not the best look for the board at large to go after 2 people who couldn't come up with a majority unless 6 members of the board just stopped showing up.
Right.
Like it just doesn't look good. Pass a resolution, we see boards pass bogus resolutions every meeting, for God's sakes. Like, pass a resolution stating that you vehemently oppose whatever that these 2 individuals are doing or representing. You have the majority. You can do that sort of thing.
Well, and those 2 were elected by the voters. They have every right to occupy their seats as the other 7. They have the right to dissent. It's part of we keep coming back to our universal themes, and that's one of them, is just the divisiveness of politics has reached down to a lower and lower level. It's become less possible for people to just simply disagree and say, that's okay, you have your opinion, I have mine, we'll take a vote. That's why we have boards. That's why we don't let one person decide. That's why we have 9 So whatever 5 or more decide, okay, I made my case, I lost this time, I accept that, I move on. But we don't see that so much anymore.
Amazon's dead. Did you hear that?
Yeah, a couple times.
So
are they coming upstate or what?
Hopefully this is the last time we have to talk about this. Between this and the whole push for some lawmakers to talk about splitting upstate and downstate New York, I am so completely tired of hearing about these two things because neither one of them, frankly, had much teeth to begin with, or many teeth to begin with. Amazon's dead. It's not coming upstate. It's not going downstate. It's going to Nashville. It's going to Music City. And good for them, I guess. Is there any element of surprise to this, or should we have seen this coming all along? Because I kind of, with the amount of opposition, with frankly, the unrealistic expectation of how much was going to be given back in terms of tax breaks, it kind of seemed, even though it had been announced and it was pushed as if it were very real, it didn't, I guess. At least not to me. It didn't seem like it was really fully going to happen. I don't know.
I guess I'm a little surprised just because once the deal's been reached, then what do you care if some people don't like it? Take your tax money and run. But the larger issue is how many millions or billions of our tax dollars do we want to give to billionaires in order for them to grace us with their presence? And I understand, if we don't, someone else will, and that's the problem. It's the race to the bottom. So, and why one company over another? I mean, there was just a story in the DNC the other day about some company in Rochester that's getting, and I don't even remember who it is. They're getting $4 million. To their credit, they're putting up $4 million of their own to do a plant expansion. But why one business over another? I keep going to downtown Geneva. Part of the DRI money went to a microbrewery. I love microbreweries. But why does one get money from the state to help them along and the other 50 or 100 in the Finger Lakes don't? I mean, it's a scattershot approach to economic development. And either there should be a pool of money that everybody can tap into to get some help, or we should just say, you know what, you want to build a business, build a business. And my own personal thoughts on economic development is I think we go about it completely backwards. We go about it from the business side. If you want economic development, then what we need to do is foster a strong middle class with discretionary income in their pockets. And then guess what? If there's a lot of people, if a bunch of people in Seneca Falls and Waterloo and Geneva and Canandaigua all have money to spend, someone will build a business to take it from them.
Yeah, I think, whenever we talk about economic development, we end up talking about all these ancillary issues that are connected to it. What does the population look like? What does the workforce look like? Is there a hole in the 20 to 49 age segment? Are there... how educated is that prospective workforce? Like, all of these things are things that, frankly, matter. And when people talk about, maybe Amazon was going to come upstate, they would never come upstate. And if they did, they would go to Rochester or Syracuse.
Right.
And that would have almost no effect on a Seneca Falls, on a Waterloo, the list goes on, Tyrone. You can talk about all of these small communities. It just won't have an impact on them. These places are economically depressed because there aren't essential services. Essential services do not meet the minimum standard of other comparable places. And when I say comparable places, I don't actually mean comparable places. I mean the places they're competing against. Seneca Falls is competing against Rochester. Yeah, Rochester is in the Finger Lakes Economic Development circuit, but it isn't the same thing. It just isn't. And we're almost at a point now where I think we have to start looking at if we're going to take economic development seriously. If we think these big, giant companies, I think that's the wrong approach. I think you start small and work your way up. But if you want to land these big, giant companies, you're going to have to invest some money in the infrastructure. You're going to have to invest some money in the things that are going to make Seneca Falls, places like I'm thinking some of the smaller villages, Rushville, Penyon, some of these smaller communities that have seen a little bit of revitalization through like a DRI. You're going to have to make them appealing for people who don't just want to work there, but want to live there. I
don't even know if you can do that, though, because if you're the kind of person who's going to work at this Amazon, and again, I think we need to remind ourselves, this wasn't just a shipping plant. These aren't people that are slapping, mailing tape and labels on boxes and sending them out, making $100 and something thousand a year. And I wish I could remember where I saw this article, but somebody had a good article about the clustering effect where people want to live around these population centers. If I'm an executive let's say I'm the CEO of a company and I want to build my plant that's going to employ 100 people, and I live in some other part of the country, but I want to be able to come check on my plant. Do I want my plant to be in Tyrone, where I have to fly into the Rochester or Syracuse or Ithaca airport and get a car and drive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when I fly home, I have to leave Rochester, connect in Atlanta, go somewhere else? Or do I want to be in New York City, where I have 2 international airports with direct flights all over the world every hour, every day? I don't think those kinds of industries are going to locate in rural America anymore. And as we've talked about, the kind of industries that used to locate in rural America, your canning plants and your factories, have gone to other places now. So I just don't think you're not going to get this Amazon plant to come upstate New York, even to Rochester, because again, with all due respect, do I want to fly out of a mid-size airport where I have to connect through a hub, or do I want to have my plant a few miles from JFK and LaGuardia where I can get on a direct flight to LA and be there in 3 hours?
So, to that end, it's interesting you mentioned that article, because just this past week I was listening to a podcast, and they were basically talking about that effect, and they were talking about that effect in Buffalo, Syracuse, and Rochester. And how the suburbs of those cities, as well as the actual urban centers, are seeing a bit of call it not a housing boom, but there just isn't enough housing stock to keep up with the demand because of the droves of people who are coming to these places. And it's interesting because it basically sets up a scenario, and they admitted as much while they were having this discussion. Maybe living in a rural community won't be viable in 20 or 30 years. Maybe it just won't. I don't know.
I think you might be right. And to go back to take a look at, you mentioned people wanting to live in a particular place. Take a look at downtown Geneva. Downtown Geneva didn't set out to have a big plan to attract businesses to downtown. When I came to the Finger Lakes in 2003, I think the vacancy rate was something like 50% or something. Now it's almost zero. Why? Because what did Geneva bring in? It brought in arts and great food and night spots, so people wanted to live in Geneva. So guess what happens when people want to live in a place? People start businesses to cater to those people. Maybe small communities in America, instead of spending money trying to attract businesses, spend money on quality of life that will make people want to live there, and then when people live there, businesses will pop up to serve those people.
Yeah, and something you just brought something into my mind. Create the community.
Yeah.
Create a community. That's basically what it sounds like you're saying, and it basically sounds like what most small rural communities are going to have to do if they want to start attracting people back again.
And especially, I think, the younger generation, your millennials, whatever they're called now, your 20-somethings, early 30-somethings, I think lifestyle is very important to those people. They want... We've gone full cycle from the 50s when everything was spread out in strip malls and people lived in suburbs 30 miles away and commuted to work. Now increasingly people want to be able to walk to work or take their bicycle or jump in their little hybrid and drive 3 miles to work. We're seeing that the Solar Village in Geneva. They're building these small homes that are geared to those young professionals who want to be near all the cultural amenities of Geneva. So I just think maybe we need to just flip the whole approach around and think about developing lifestyle and making an area a place where people want to live, and wherever people gather, businesses will come in.
Yeah, and I think that's where, I think back to the debate around the Huntington building in Seneca Falls, and, the folks who are saying, the proponents of it, of maintaining the building, who are saying, well, Seneca Falls can be very walkable. You can create this is a key to making Seneca Falls walkable. No, there are like 18 other keys that are crucial to making Seneca Falls walkable that those boxes aren't checked off yet, that have to be checked off before this matters. And I think that becomes the issue. Like, it's funny. I live in Brighton, and my fiance and I are a 3.5-minute drive from the city proper of Rochester. It's not really walkable. There's good public transportation if that's what you need, but it's very suburban. It's very busy. We're near the MCC campus. There's hustle and bustle. We are in Seneca Falls, 43 miles from Rochester, the nearest actually walkable community that is a completely walkable community. You can walk to the grocery store. You can walk to work. You can walk to your home. You can walk to the rec center. You can walk to the gym. You can do all of the things by walking. Geneva, closer, I guess, maybe, but, even still walking from, if you live downtown, walking to Wegmans and then walking back, and then if you have a doctor's appointment, maybe that's up on Preemption Road where all the medical offices seem to be. It just isn't. Like, none of these communities, I feel like people are being very disingenuous with themselves when they say, especially when they're stakeholders, and they say, we have this walkable community. No, you don't. You don't have a walkable community.
And I think that's why the town of Geneva has several of these planned unit developments going on. One of them is and I always forget the name of them, I think it's Geneva Crossing is the one at the former driving range at the intersection of 5 and 20 and Preemption Road. And I believe the plan is there for a mixture of residential and service-type businesses. The zoning model of a lot of the 20th century was keep businesses over here, keep homes over here, and now I think people want, like you say, it's nice if you can walk to your doctor's office 5 minutes from home. So I think we're seeing maybe some of these things beginning to happen. It's just going to take some time to change attitudes and behaviors that have been ingrained for a long time. Well,
and to that end, we live in a society that's about as fast-paced as it could possibly be. Now, you can say that walking from downtown Geneva to Wegmans is no big deal, but for most people, that's going to take probably 30, maybe 25 to 30 minutes. I don't know. Well,
and then you're also...
I've never timed that walk,
right.
But, it's just not... If you cannot instantly get to the place where you're going, it almost...
And I mean, unless you walk, up around Washington Street or whatever, you've got to go up 5 and 20 where there's 4 lanes of traffic whizzing by. I'm not even sure there's a sidewalk all the way.
I think...
Maybe
no, I
don't
think that actually. If you're I
don't know if there is up the going up the hill
Yeah.
towards the Hobart William Smith campus.
Yeah,
there may not be a place to walk there.
So here's it, and I just thought back to a conversation we had on another podcast a few weeks ago. I had Victor Supervisor Jack Marin in, and after that podcast, we were all sort of sitting around, and he had already taken off, but we're sitting there talking about the Eastview Mall. And one of the ideas that sort of popped up a little bit from time to time is, well, what if instead of using those anchor spaces for stores, you converted them into housing? And you actually started moving these shopping centers, which are slowly but surely emptying out, not really slowly but surely anymore, but just kind of emptying out. What if you converted them into actual communities, walkable communities, real live walkable communities? Because that's about as much walking, I think, as most society has in it. I think there's an argument there, and I think that's the type of what people tend to forget is that most rural communities, towns, villages, they're spread out. Maybe less villages, but towns definitely, they're spread out over a large area. And if you really want to have something that's walkable, it has to be knit really closely together. And unless you have that component checked off, it's really hard to do all the rest. And, when you're talking about a 30-minute walk to a grocery store and a 25-minute walk to the doctor's office, when I think some people are trying to call back to the era of the 30s, 40s, and 50s when people could do that, but there were corner stores. People did their grocery shopping at one of the 7 grocery stores in Seneca Falls, one of the probably 24 in Geneva. I mean, there were all of these things where you weren't spending any more than just a couple minutes of your time going to do these things. It was pretty much equally as efficient as getting in the car and driving to Wegmans is today.
Well, and I think it's just going to take a long time to undo some of those decisions of the 50s. I mean, I've said many times since I've come to the Finger Lakes, if we go back to the 50s and find the guy who decided it would be a good idea to put a 4-lane highway between downtown Geneva and the lake and strangle him, it's just, I mean, that's what passed for urban or suburban planning in those days. And it's interesting to watch this evolution, because I think we're going to see more of those kinds of things that you talked about, these mixed communities. And it's not just walkability, but it's being close by. Even if it's a drive, it's a short drive as opposed to having to drive 25 or 30 minutes someplace. I mean, I had an uncle growing up, worked at Prudential Insurance in Boston, lived in southern New Hampshire. We had about a 40-mile commute each way every day, and that's into Boston. That's probably, I don't know how long it took to go 40 miles back in the 70s, probably an hour and a half then and 2 hours now.
Yeah, it's honestly incredible stuff. So a new Senate proposal would require employers to deduct federal student loan payments from workers' paychecks. This sounds exciting. The plans, backed by Republican head of Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, would require borrowers to choose between having 10% of income taken out of their paychecks or deducted over a decade. People who borrow can choose now between 14 different repayment plans that don't require essentially what is wage garnishment. But consumer advocates say this would essentially force people to divert money from things like buying a house, things like, being able to advance their life, and choose between that and loan repayment if it's being forced, taken out. I'm not sure if I completely subscribe to that.
Well, I think that argument is incredibly weak. I think a much better argument is, why do we want to saddle employers with one more responsibility? I mean, if you borrow the money, that's a pretty bad argument to say, well, these poor people that borrow the money can't afford to pay it back. Well, then don't borrow it. I mean, that's how that works. But yeah, it's another thing to put on employers. And I guess maybe if people aren't paying back student loans, then a more important question is to figure out why. And or maybe students shouldn't be borrowing so much to begin with. I mean, that's we have a show that's 3 hours every day devoted to that very topic almost every day, Dave Ramsey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting too, is like, how many different initiatives are we going to see pushed forward before we finally address the elephant in the room, which is the cost of higher education? I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? Yeah,
well, and I have a theory of that I don't really hear talked about that much, and that is, I think that aid is constantly chasing the cost. If you make a pool of $1 million of aid available, then the colleges are going to collectively raise their price of attendance by $1 million. I mean, I don't think that necessarily giving a lot of financial aid is the right idea. I think that drives up the cost. I think if all student financial aid were to disappear tomorrow, colleges would be forced to price themselves more realistically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are so many issues in higher education right now that I'm not sure it's really smart for any of it, especially with the student debt problem the way it is now, the way it's structured now. I think we need to come up with a better solution to the cost element of it, and we need to stop worrying about what about the people who already because I think we fall into that. I mean, when you talk about legalizing marijuana, the conversation instantly goes to, well, what about all the people who've been convicted? There needs to be an element of, while you're governing, looking forward and not always looking backward, or at least creating policy moving forward that is better so that these situations don't happen again.
Well, and there has become, I think, an expectation now that is just a rite of passage to begin your adult life with a $50,000 or $100,000 or $200,000 debt from going to school. And I think you have to ask yourself, would I be better off with less education and a slightly lower income than an education that gets me a better job, but all that money I get from that job has to go back to paying for the education? I mean, you kind of have a chicken and egg thing going on there.
Yeah, and we're running towards the cliff, I feel like, with higher education, and something's going to have to change. You also have to talk about changing what higher education actually is, how it's treated. You're seeing the K through 12 side of education evolve a little bit and start to change the way it functions, with more ninth grade through graduation, high school graduation programs being focused on getting students not just ready for the academic side of college, but whatever might come next for them, whether that's a job or some sort of work program or something to that effect. And I think colleges need to sort of jump on that boat too and work more to create the complete range of services rather than focus solely on, this element of what we do isn't working right or needs to be improved, or this thing. Focus on connecting the dots, and then you'll start to see some, I think you'd probably start to see some actual change on that front.
And again, a fundamental question is, what is higher education for? Is it to train one to enter the workforce, or is it to expand one's mind with new ideas and encourage some sort of out-of-the-box thought? And we're seeing at the community college level, they're much more focusing on preparing people for the job market. But what we're seeing is a lot of these people that are spending $200,000 to go into debt and getting a degree are finding that degree might not have any place in the marketplace. I mean, if you take a degree in say, philosophy or something, what's that going to get you for a job other than $200,000 in debt?
Yeah. It's interesting. And that's one that we could probably dedicate an entire hour to breaking down the different components of higher education that either don't make sense or don't work or are outdated. And I think maybe that might be something that we have when get Jackie Augustine in here, get the professor's point of view on that one also.
Well, and just point of disclaimer here, since we're talking transparency today, I am paid in part by an education of higher learning when I do sports broadcasts. So just take that for what it's worth.
So we've talked about rental properties and how they're managed and how at the community level, not at the sort of business level. Cornell recently debuted a really, really interesting rental property database. Now, it existed before. This isn't new. It's available for students. The database essentially allows students to search rental properties, does it in an interactive way, and then on top of that, gives them a scope of everything that is a rental property in the city, whether it's available or not, and does all of the search stuff that you'd expect something like that to do. So it gives you your price ranges, what the neighborhoods are like, that sort of thing. This, to me, despite the fact that it being this is just for Cornell students, this is pretty much what I think every single community that's sort of wrestled with what does our rental stock look like or what does our housing stock look like, this is what they could benefit from having a system like this, a database like this. And, we talked last year, it was probably last year, about the proposal in Auburn to create a registry, more or less, that would allow the city of Auburn to better evaluate what they have, where the holes are in the market, and then go back and fill those holes or seek out developers to fill the holes as necessary. This is perfect. It prevents your rental market from becoming top-heavy. And that's exactly the issue that we're seeing in most rural communities in the Finger Lakes. And, it goes back to the point. We have all this technology at our disposal. How hard would it be for a county or a town or whatever the case may be, I think it would probably be best fit for the counties to execute. How hard would it be for the county to manage and to regulate that database? It would. The technology would take care of itself.
Yeah, you can see a lot of uses for that. I mean, I remember when I first came to the Finger Lakes looking for a place to rent, and you would basically get the newspaper, look at a few ads, drive around and look for signs. I mean, it was a terribly inefficient way to go about it. I think maybe some of the objection to this, they say knowledge is power, and I think that some landlords might object to having that power now be in the hands of the renter, because the more you know about what's out there, probably the lower price you're going to end up paying in the long run. I don't know if that's an objection. I could see that as being an objection from the landlords, that we really don't want consumers to know every single place that's out there. I want them to think that mine is the only one, so they'll pay whatever I ask.
And that's an issue. I don't really, if that is going to be an argument, I'm not really sure that that's an argument you can take in good faith. I'm not sure that that's an argument that those folks could make in good faith without coming off very callous and very, it doesn't align, I don't think. If that's the only objection, I'm not really sure that you could see enough objection to something like this to not make it happen. It's one of those really easy ways to and also think about the encouragement. Suddenly it's not as difficult to find out what's available in a small community, like take Bloomfield for them, just use Bloomfield as an example.
Right.
You suddenly, without too much effort, can find out what's available for rent in Bloomfield. Now, of course, there are platforms online already that do this sort of thing, but they don't include all of the properties.
Right. Everybody's got their own sort of chunk of the market.
Right. And that's where I sort of think like a complete database would be immensely beneficial to everyone involved, and you would also be able to get a better sense of what's going on in those places. If rent is significantly higher in Seneca Falls than Waterloo, and Seneca Falls should, in theory, be in line with Waterloo,
right,
then the question would become, why is that? Well, why is there greater demand to live in Seneca Falls than Waterloo? And it creates more information and more data for the people who are trying to promote economic development.
Right. I think that could be
more
very...
tools in their belt to be able to take and say, well, look, there's this opportunity for this price range in Romulus. Take advantage of that, developer. Like, you're going to realize your investment 5 years faster because X, Y, and Z.
That's a good point, actually, from the developer end, right? I mean, if you see that there's a need in a particular community, then someone's going to go fill that need.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people might be scared off by this because of the perception that this would be a means to identify and to develop more low-income housing, and we know how people tend to be opposed to that in some parts of the community. So maybe that would be part of the slant of the argument against it. You're going to see if say it is top heavy in one community, that's going to encourage a developer to come in and create low-income rental properties. Well, I don't want that. But I think the good outweighs the bad in terms of what you can possibly do in terms of economic development for a small community. When you are desperate for people to come live in your community, everybody wants more people living in their town.
Yeah. Well, and I think another question is how do we make this work? I guess you have to make it compulsory that when somebody moves out, you have to report that. Otherwise, the database won't stay up to date.
Yeah, and you know what? I think it becomes as simple as it's a box. It's a box you check off.
Yeah.
How many units? What's the price range? You don't have to ask what the specific price is. Get the price range. Collect the same information that those online databases that already exist. They're capturing like different chunks of 20 to 30% of the rental market are collecting, and just go from there. Use that. And then, down the road, if you want to If you find an easier way to collect different pieces of data from that, go for it. But I think it's a net positive. Before we get out of here, where can folks hear you on the radio Monday through Friday?
The Finger Lakes Morning News is on WAUB in Auburn. That's 98.1 FM, 1590 AM. And in Geneva, we're on WGVA. That is 95.9 FM. And I'll have to check on the way back to see if the guy has installed the power supply. If so, it'll be 1240 AM as well.
All right. Well, appreciate the time. And that's all the time we have for today. Remember, if you like what we're doing, rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or listen to us on your favorite streaming platform. You know, that's like Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, all those places. We will be back next week. Until then, be well, stay informed, keep reading.